What is your gendered understanding of, quote, men's roles and women's roles in society, and how does that bleed into the church? So all of these things impact what women can and cannot do in churches. But the part that gets left out of that narrative is that there would be no shift of Christianity from north to south if not for women.
Welcome to the Lausanne Movement Podcast, where we have a passion to accelerate global mission together. If you like today's episode, won't you take a moment to rate and review our podcast and subscribe? That way you won't miss a thing. And now, for today's interview. Well, Dr. Gina Zerlo, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everyone.
It's a joy for me to host you today. I've personally been really looking forward to our conversation together. You've managed to publish the first textbook to focus on women's experience in the founding, spread, and continuation of the Christian faith, which is an impressive task. And I know it was a big undertaking for you and your team. And so today I'm really hoping that we can unpack some of those findings, but I'm also hoping that we can go beyond the data and get practical about the role of women in the global church. And so to kick us off, could you take a moment to briefly frame the study that you conducted for women in world Christianity? Why was it commissioned? What was the scope? But more specifically, I would be interested to hear what originally sparked your passion and your interest in this topic. You know, this is a massive undertaking, and I'm not a researcher myself, but I wouldn't want to research something that I wouldn't have a passion for. And so I'm sure that there's something there. So if there's any personal experiences, encounters that inspire you to pursue this, it'd be really interesting to hear that.
Yeah, first, just thank you so much for having me on the podcast to talk about this really important subject on women in world Christianity. I feel like it's one of those subjects that people are a little bit aware of, but might not be fully aware of all of the details or the history or the trends. So I really value the opportunity to share with the Lausanne Movement audience about this project. So where this project came from was kind of a mix of academics and my personal experience as a woman in world Christianity. So I did my PhD at Boston University School of Theology, working with Dr. Dana Robert, who's one of the foremost experts on women in mission history, women in world Christianity. And she famously wrote an article in 2006 in the International Bulletin of Mission Research called World Christianity as a Woman's Movement. And she made two arguments in that article. The first was world Christianity is a woman's movement because most churches worldwide are made up of majority women. And the second reason was that there have been gendered reasons for conversion to Christianity throughout all of church history, that there are different reasons why men join churches and different reasons why women join churches. And we've seen across time and place and church tradition that it was often women who were the first converts to Christianity in a particular geographic location. So she gives all kinds of examples in this article. So academically, I'm working with a mentor who's very tuned in to what's happening with women in the global church and learning a lot about women in church history, women in mission, women in missiological thought. But then I have my own personal experience as a woman in world Christianity, and what I was experiencing myself wasn't always aligning with what I knew to be true from the historical record and from the social science that I was reading. So for example, in 2015, 16, 17, 18, I was going to a lot of global Christian meetings. That's a really core part of my job as the co-director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. We love to go to international conferences where people are coming from all over the world because we get to network and meet people, and that's really like the bread and butter of what I do in a lot of ways. So I was going to all these meetings, and I was noticing over and over and over that I was one of very few women in the room. And it really started to bother me that I knew intellectually women make up the majority of churches, missionaries around the world, kind of the boots on the ground are women, the worker bees are the women, and like everyone's saying, and on the one hand, women are the backbone of the church, and then I'm going to all these meetings where there's hardly any women to be found. And so to me, this kind of reached a climax in 2018. I went to another global Christian meeting, was very few women in the room, and I just kind of broke, honestly, and said, we have to do something about this. We need data. We need good information to show that women really are central to what's happening, and they're being left out of the conversation in a lot of these spaces that I'm interacting in. So 2018 is when the Women in World Christianity Project was launched, which was a truly crazy idea to assign a percent Christian female to every denomination in every country of the world. Because as the editor of the World Christian Database, I have a go big or go home mentality. If you're gonna add a new variable to the database, it's gotta be every country. 237 countries, thousands of denominations. That's the only way to really do global work from our perspective. But the reason I thought this was possible was because we had just come off of 5 years of research of the World Christian Encyclopedia, which is the history and demographics of Christianity in every country of the world. And so I thought, well, this will be easy. I'll just go back to all of the information that we collected over that 5-year period to write the encyclopedia, and I'll just reanalyze it through a gendered lens and see what are all these churches and denominations and networks saying about women in their movements. And so I got some funding from the Louisville Institute, a project grant for researchers. I got some funding from the Religious Research Association. And then me and some research assistants started diving into the data. And after months and months and months, we finally realized there is no gendered lens to look through, because all of these churches and denominations that are collecting all kinds of information all the time are actually not reporting what share of their churches and congregations are women. And this was pretty disappointing, actually. I think disappointment was the first emotion I had when I realized this, because it's not that people don't count stuff. These churches know how many pastors they have, how many children, how many baptisms, how much money, how to keep the lights on. They know what's going on. So is it that they do know how many women are in their congregations and they don't report it? Or is that, are they not asking the question at all? And I still haven't decided which is worse, honestly. And I think it might be either or, depending on who you talk to. So that was one of the major findings of the project, was the complete and utter lack of gender awareness in a lot of these churches around the world.
Yeah, and I mean, it's actually an insane reality to realize that, we do measure what's important to us, right? And so surely if women were important, we would be counting those numbers. And so, like you say, which question is more of a terrible thing to look at? It's quite hard to decide. And, mentioning global gatherings, Lausanne is famous for collecting global leaders, and we're not immune to this fact that we can collect a global group of people together, and when we look around the room, there are a majority men in the room. And so we are trying to bridge that gap, and perhaps we can dive into that a little bit later. But I would love to hear from you. Let's dive into some of the research. You discuss how women have been central to the historic spread of global Christianity. Could you unpack this for us a bit, just so that we can understand the historic nature of it, and then we can begin to look at what's happening in the present?
So there's been a lot of historical work that has come out recently to make women more central in church history. If you go to any syllabus and any church history course, I'm going to say anywhere in the world, it's mostly the story of men, powerful men, and their institutions. That's what most church history was institutional history. And historically, and even today, most institutions are run by men. So if you're only doing institutional history, you're going to miss the popular level, the grassroots level, which is where women were working. So the social history turn in the 1960s and 70s really gave rise to women's history, where now people were saying, well, actually, what voices have we not heard from the archives before? What's actually happening on the ground? And when you do that, when you look at different kinds of sources, ask different sets of questions, and approach the historical project with a different set of assumptions, then you can see women. You see that women were not just passive receptors of what was happening in a monarchy or, with some kind of trickle-down impact. Women were actually active agents and receptors of the faith and spreaders of the faith. And one of my favorite books is actually Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, not a historian, so you can take it with a grain of salt. But he wrote this book called The Rise of Christianity, where chapter 3 was dedicated to women in the early church. And he gives a sociological analysis of how women's involvement in the early church was one of the reasons why early Christianity actually survived. Because women were there saving the lives of people who got the plague, of Christian people, right? So pagans were dying out from the plague and Christians were surviving. And women who became Christian first were marrying pagan men and then converting their husbands, a secondary conversion, and then having Christian families. So he makes this really compelling argument that the only reason Christianity even survived from its infancy was because of women. And that, I think, has gotten lost in a lot of our understandings of church history as the church became institutionalized over the centuries and these really prominent female voices got left out of the historical narrative. Purposely, let's keep that in mind. It was purposeful to remove women and remove women's agency from the historical record. So now we have amazing scholars like Dana Robert, like Connie Schmo, like Barbara Reeves Ellington, like all kinds of people. Elizabeth Muir wrote a fantastic book in 2019, The Women's History of the Christian Church, who are rediscovering church history. And when we do that, we can see all of the ways that world Christianity is world Christianity because of women.
Wow, thank you for setting that up for us. As you were speaking, I was just reminded of some of the biographies of the men that I've read, of Augustine and of the Wesleys, and how their stories are so intricately connected to their mothers and their influence on their children. And so, just connecting back, and I'm wondering, where are the biographies of those women? And I'm sure they're out there, but they're surely not popping up on my feed. So in what ways are women shaping global Christianity today? Because those of us who are listening, we have that framework from wherever we are in the world. We have a framing of what women's roles are in our own countries and our own cultures. Can you provide examples of just how women are shaping Christianity?
So the way I like to approach this question is from a longer historical perspective of the demographic shift of Christianity to the global south. That's the main story of world Christianity studies. We even have a such thing as world Christianity studies because of the demographic shift of Christianity from global north to global south. But the part that gets left out of that narrative is that there would be no shift of Christianity from north to south if not for women. And so even the first generation of world Christianity scholars in the 60s and 70s were not focusing on women's stories. This is a common theme you will see. The first generation of theologians were not considering women. The first generation of global south theologians were not considering women. And so women's stories and perspectives and histories are consistently an afterthought. And that is the same case in world Christianity. So when we revisit the historical record, you see Bible women, for example, indigenous evangelists who received the gospel and then were trained local evangelists who spread the gospel throughout their local networks. Who's better at doing something through a local network than women? Let's be honest, right? And so these women went door to door, they went through their social networks, and they spread the gospel. There would be no shift of Christianity in the global south without Bible women. And yet so many of these women are unnamed. We'll never know who they are because nobody wrote down their names. Their stories haven't been written. They're kind of trapped in oral history is the only way to know kind of how these women worked and who they were. And oral history is really difficult because of language reasons and whatnot. So Bible women are a really important piece of this because they had access to communities that Western missionaries could not have. And so I think continuing that to today, we still see women with this social influence, maybe a soft power, especially where they're excluded from maybe more formal kinds of leadership in society and church and kinds of Christian networks. At the ground level, women are highly influential with lots of power and authority in local communities that they use for the advancement of Christianity, for making their societies and communities healthier and more whole from a Christian perspective. So you look at any congregation in the world, it's mostly women. I know this from empirical research. I know this from my own interaction with Christians around the world. You ask any single person, is your church more men or women? And hands down, 100% of the time, they will say women. So they clearly are still central to the continuation of the faith to the next generations.
Well, I mean, as you were speaking, I was just thinking of my own heritage and my own story. And both my grands were amazing women of God. And the one grand, she was moved from city to city. My grandfather was in construction. And when she moved into a new community, she would start a Bible study. And in some cases, the Bible studies got big enough that eventually the denomination called in a real pastor to take over the church. And in those communities, I mean, the pastor would be recognized as the founding pastor, and her name is missing from the record. And if it wasn't for her,
She's the founder.
yeah, she was the founder. And it's, for me, it's such an inspiring story of my own lineage. She was a church planner, and there weren't even words for that back then. And so I would be interested, what have been some of the most surprising or inspiring findings as people have been engaging in your research? What have inspired them and what has surprised them? And how has it challenged their and your own assumptions about the global church?
My friend and colleague, Michelle Sigg, she runs the Dictionary of African Christian Biography, and she wrote this fantastic article about the Fifa Hazana revival of Madagascar, which is the longest running revival in the world, entirely led by women. And the word that she uses to describe these women is subversive apostles. And I love this phrase so much because it really, I think, symbolizes the role and the authority that women have in Christianity, even though that authority is not always recognized. So they're subversive, not in a nefarious way, in a positive way. Sometimes a little subversion can go a long way. And that's a common theme you see throughout church history and women today. When denied an opportunity in one perspective or one lane, they just find another way around. They find another way around the rules. When denied a seat at the main table, they create their own tables. And so for me, that's been really inspiring to see that women have all of these challenges and obstacles from both within the church and outside the church that are really trying to prevent them to do the work that they feel called to do. But this utter commitment for service and for faithfulness, it gives them this creativity out of necessity to break barriers. And so for me, in the book, there's this series of female firsts, right? Who was the first woman to lead this church? Who was the first woman to be a bishop? Who was the first woman to engage in peace building work? And all these female firsts. You just think of all the obstacles that they had to overcome and this sheer utter determination to make it happen. So that's been really inspiring for me when I encounter my own challenges and obstacles, in the church. And all the women that I talk to around the world are experiencing these challenges too. We have this kind of body of witnesses, a cloud of witnesses to say all these women overcame. And so we can too.
As I was preparing for this interview, one of the things that I was really curious about, considering how many denominations and countries and cultures that you've been able to engage with for the study, could you discuss the different ways in which women have been perceived and are engaged within the church across all these different areas, the denominations, countries, national groups, cultural groups? I mean, it's very diverse. But I would love to hear the different ways that women are being engaged with, because I think very often we can put it into two boxes. Either the churches are lifting women up, putting them on like as pastors, and in the other case, we're putting women into the corner. And it's kind of, we have this picture, but actually the world is so much more diverse. And so I would love to hear how that's playing out globally.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and something to always remember when we're talking about big global trends, and even words like global north, global south. There is no such thing as a global north Christianity or a global south Christianity. There's no such thing as an Asian Christianity, right? Asia is tremendously diverse. So we use these phrases for the sake and the limitations of language, but there is a tremendous amount of diversity out there in terms of how churches read and interpret Scripture. What is the role of Scripture in the life of the church? How literal should you be interpreting Scripture? What tools do you have to interpret Scripture? What is the role of tradition? How tightly will you hold to tradition? What is your gendered understanding of, quote, men's roles and women's roles in society, and how does that bleed into the church? So all of these things impact what women can and cannot do in churches. And I think one road this leads me down is just the fact that this conversation has to exist of what women can and cannot do in churches. Men never have to ask what they can and cannot do in a church. Men can pretty much do whatever they want in churches. I mean, some places they might find it odd if maybe the man is taking care of the kids in the nursery on the Sunday morning, but it's not that he can't do that, right? So women are constantly navigating what they can and cannot do and trying to balance that with what they feel called to do, what they feel like God is leading them to do. So it's actually really hard to make these blanket statements like, oh, women in Africa this and women in Asia that. you really can't do that. But there are certain cultural challenges. So, for example, women in East Asia have to reconcile with Confucian culture, which has very clear-cut hierarchies for men and women, for parents, for siblings, and a lot of that has been adapted into church culture that kind of gives East Asian women an additional challenge when it comes to, for example, becoming pastors. So there's a lot of research coming out of South Korea about how Korean women are navigating Confucian culture and gendered responsibilities and what they feel like they can do in churches. In the Latin American context, you have machismo. So you have machismo culture, and how does that play into gendered roles in Latin America, which appear to be really restrictive for women in a lot of ways. And yet, what are they doing to work with that and to reform machismo culture? So we see these examples of how culture most definitely has a role in this, and it differs everywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question that was framing in my mind was you and I we have a very Western perspective, and understanding and the theology of womanhood and manhood, and we kind of put those into boxes. And I was wondering, and you've touched on it with machismo, and have there been any unique perspectives that kind of break the Western paradigm, that theological paradigm that we hold? And I realize I'm also putting Western into a big category here, but I suppose you understand what I'm saying. Have there been any that really stand out to you that are unique?
Yeah, so I think one that stands out to me is the work that comes out of Sub-Saharan Africa, the Circle of Concerned Women Theologians. When I read theology from women of the circle, it doesn't contradict Western theology, but it definitely poses challenges to Western theology in ways that I was not exposed to in my theological education, and yet makes a lot of sense. And the reason it poses these challenges is because it is so inherently holistic. These women are not just writing one article about Christology. No, it's Christology tied to the land, tied to the person of Jesus, tied to women's experiences, tied to land right? It's all so interconnected because life is so interconnected. So they have not separated their theology from their personal experience, and they haven't separated their theology from their communities and from their land and from the real socioeconomic political challenges that they face in their context. Whereas Western theology, frankly, just doesn't do that. It's very segmented, and it does not speak into real life contexts in the way that you see this theology from Sub-Saharan Africa. And so that's why I make such a concerted effort in the book to include women theologians from around the world, to encourage our Western readers to engage theologically with these women, to just get a different perspective on what does it really mean to be a Christian in this world today. For me to answer that question, I got to read Global South Women. That's how I really start to understand what does it mean to be a Christian in the world today. They're the ones who are really illuminating that question in a very new, refreshing, and authentic way.
Wonderful. Thank you for that example. I'm going to make sure that we put that in the show notes for those who are listening. I would love for us to get practical, but before we do that, just one last question concerning the data, and what has been your key takeaway from the study? What has left the biggest impact on you and why?
One of the key takeaways for me is how important it is to make women central and not marginal. I think a lot of churches, organizations, parachurch organizations, mission organizations, frankly, take women for granted. They take women for granted that they're going to show up, that they're going to participate, that they're going to cook the Sunday morning breakfast, that they're going to watch the kids, that they're going to go on the missions trip. The list goes on and on and on. But really, when you look at how churches talk about women, the lack of data about women, the lack of understanding of women's experiences, it's just very clear to me that male leaders are not talking to women. So I think one of my key takeaways is really an action item, which is for men to take women more seriously and value them more highly and champion them and also talk to them and listen to them. Because when we see that kind of interaction happening, it's not just good for women, it's good for everybody. Because men have a greater understanding of women, women have a greater understanding of men, and the community all has a better understanding of each other and can fulfill its mission together. And when you see that happen around the world, it's a really beautiful thing. So I think that's one of the things I really would like people to take away from this project, and one thing that I've taken away from it.
So, I mean, let's unpack some of those realities for us. You mentioned the need for men to take women more seriously within their churches and within ministries. Could you unpack that? I mean, there's a very strong theological argument, and these things have been going on for years. And I don't want to dive too deeply into the theology, but I want to dive into the practicality of it, right? So, speaking to men across the spectrums as best we can, what advice would you give them? Because regardless of where we sit on the spectrum, I mean, we still have more women sitting in our churches than men, right? And so,
Right.
how do we faithfully steward those women within our communities?
And it's a great question. It's the question we should be asking. And I too want to reiterate that I am not a biblical studies scholar and I am not a trained theologian. So I am fully aware that a range of interpretations and opinions exist on this issue. That actually has nothing to do with men listening to women. Men can listen to women whether or not you have women pastors or believe women should be pastors. It's actually irrelevant. So the women of your congregation need to be heard in no matter what capacity they are working and serving. In many ways, women are the main stakeholder of your congregation. If the women disappeared, the whole thing would utterly collapse because they're working behind the scenes to keep this thing up. They are the scaffolding of your church. So, how much do male leaders really understand what's going on in the lives of women? I'm going to guess very little, actually, based on what I see from the research and what I've experienced in all kinds of churches in my life. So, what could be set up practically where women have opportunities to share with their leaders what's actually happening behind the scenes in a church? Or if a pastor says something that maybe is a little bit sexist, do they have an opportunity to actually say that, to help offer a helpful corrective to male leaders? Because often women just silently suffer. They silently suffer not being heard, being a part of ineffective systems, listening to borderline sexist or openly sexist things that are being said from pulpits. It does happen. So do women feel safe and comfortable enough in their congregations to approach a pastor or to approach another female leader who's working with a pastor, right? So are there different models and methods and systems that can be set up to ensure women's safety and women being heard? I don't think that's actually as difficult as maybe it sounds. I think it's actually quite easy. And there's, again, research on this, that when women feel safe to confide in a leader, it's better for the whole organization.
So could you give some practical examples of what that might look like? So you have a leader, he's listening, he's saying, I would love for that to be a reality. Blind spots are blind spots for a reason. You don't know you have them. And so how do we open up those spaces? And I mean, I might sit here and say, oh, I feel like the women in my church feel safe, but are they really? I mean, that's a question that I need to ask myself. And so could you give some practical suggestions of how we could potentially do that within our churches and ministries?
One I actually heard from. I gave a talk on my research at a Christian setting, and I had a male leader of a church came to me, and he said, hey, my church has been ordaining women for many, many decades, and we thought everything was fine. And he said, but then a few months ago, we actually asked ourselves, hey, what do our women pastors actually think about X, Y, or Z? And so they set up intentional listening sessions where the women pastors and women staff were able to share openly and safely with the male leaders. And he said they were shocked at what they heard, that women were facing challenges that they couldn't even fathom, sexism that they did not think was present in their churches. So for them, it was as easy as, hey, on the staff level, we all know and trust each other. Can we set up listening sessions together? In other cases, I do think it's hard sometimes for women to speak openly with male leaders. There's a power dynamic, there's gender differences, there's a lot going on there. So can there be a woman leader? You don't have to call her a pastor, you can call her whatever you want to call her, who's a trusted, safe person for women to go to. So it's woman to woman, and yet you know that the women coming to this trusted leader kind of had the ear of the main leadership and can be taken seriously as somewhat of a mediary, right, between the women and the head leadership. So some kind of system like that on a very practical level could be helpful.
Oh, that's so good. Thank you for that practical advice. I think it's something that we can take to heart. Let's talk about barriers. What are some unique challenges that women face in Christian communities around the world today? And what are some ways that you've seen them address in helpful ways?
So I think one of the barriers we have is a lack of mentors. And this is not church specific. This is any industry, any area of society. If you don't see someone like you advancing or at the top of the chain or as the CEO or whatever it is, it's hard for you to see yourself there if you don't see anyone who looks like you. And this is related to gender. It's also related to race, right? If you are a person of color and you don't see other people of color achieving something, it's hard for you to imagine yourself doing that. So how do you get those models? So part of it is these, right, trailblazing people who are able to cut through all of the nonsense and all of the barriers in order to achieve that thing. That's really hard to do. That's why those female firsts are so inspiring, because honestly, sometimes you read them and you think, I don't know if I could do it. I don't know if I have the strength myself to cut through all of that. But another piece of this, because the way I framed it all right now is women achieving. And that's true. Women want to achieve. But what's the barrier? It's men. Men who are preventing women from achieving. So this is a two-way street. What can men do who are already in positions of leadership to help raise up women, high qualified, energetic, on fire women? So a part of the problem that we have in church settings is, and I say this all very carefully, overly cautious men who don't want to be Me Too'd, right? That they don't want to spend time alone with women in a mentorship situation the way you might with young men. And so if women don't have access to male mentors because they can't be in a room together alone, or they can't be in a car together alone, or all of these rules that we've set up for how men and women should interact in church settings, if men leaders can only do that with other men, women are being left out of mentorship opportunities. So we need a complete reframing of what it means to mentor people. We cannot just have women mentoring women and men mentoring men, because there's not enough women mentors yet. We are not at that stage where that can happen. So we need men who can step out and be bold to mentor young women. That absolutely has to happen. And there are ways to do it healthily. There are ways to do it safely. There are ways to do it where you're not going to get Me Too'd. If you're not a bad behaving man, you're not going to get Me Too'd. So there are ways to do this that uplift women and allow men to invest in the next generation. And that's the thing that we should be concerned about in these organizations.
No, I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think for those who are deeply involved with the Lausanne movement, they know that at the heart of it, it began with Billy Graham and John Stott. And that whole idea of men avoiding women, Billy Graham had a rule for that. It's known as a Billy Graham rule, right? And so, I mean, I think you're touching on a soft part here in the podcast, but I'd love to unpack it a little bit more with you before we move on. You mentioned that there are some ways, because I think that fear is real. You know, that fear of being Me Too'd is real. The fear of falling is real. Wherever the fear comes from, that can be questioned. But for those who are saying, okay, I'm realizing that I might be a part of the problem, what suggestions would you make in terms of being able to create a safe space where women can be mentored by men?
It's a really good question. You are stretching me beyond what I do as an empirical researcher of just reporting on trends. And so I'll say that as a preface, but I do think it's possible. And I know it's possible because I experienced it. Todd Johnson has been my mentor for the last 15 years. And he really, frankly, took a risk in order to mentor a young woman, even though people in the evangelical space we were in probably were concerned about it. But we had our set of expectations, of rules, of boundaries, and yet we were able to travel together, which is a core part of the job. So he could teach me what we do when we go overseas and interview people and meet with scholars and so on and so forth. So I have a really positive example of that in my life, and I would not be where I am and doing what I am if I didn't have a male mentor who paved the way for me and who stepped aside so that I could shine. So really, maybe you should be asking Todd Johnson the question of how men can mentor women. But I think a lot of it maybe is, you know, do you have proper boundaries in place with your male mentees and your female mentees? I mean, power abuses happen in all kinds of gendered relationships, right? So what do you have in place with your male mentees? And should that not just be applied to your female mentees? Do you have people who you can keep accountable? Do you go to therapy? Do you see a counselor? Right? So put in some safeguards in your own life and just have a very clear set of expectations and constantly check in with each other. I think part of what made my relationship with Todd so positive is that I was able to say at some point, hey, XYZ happened, and I'm not sure you noticed how so-and-so said this really sexist thing to me, but that actually was a really sexist thing. And so he was able to say, I never actually realized that was a sexist thing. So I was able to teach him to recognize sexism in places maybe he didn't see it, and then he was able to continue mentoring me and helping me grow along the way too. So I think it's possible. I believe it's possible.
Dr. Zola, thank you for just sharing that personal experience. I think that's really helpful. Let's dive into theological education because that's where we're at right now. You note that female theologians are often overlooked in Western theological education. How should institutions change to better recognize and integrate women's theological contributions?
I love that you're asking this question because I think a lot of the times people are not even asking the question. They don't even realize what they're not doing and what they could be doing. I am cautiously optimistic that more institutes of Western theological education are having people read more broadly. So I do think that trend is finally happening, where the shift of Christianity to the global South is maybe trickling into Western theological education. I do think a lot of Western theological education still is very, you got to read whoever, I don't even know, I'm not a theologian, whoever the white male Western theologians are that you got to read, right? You got to read these men in order to understand theology. But we can read, right, James Cone or Carrie Day or maybe this occasional person of color. So it's still greatly imbalanced on what is being offered. But at the same time, I hear a lot of schools saying, well, we want to be more global. Okay, so you want more people from the global South to come get an education at your school in the United States, but what are you offering them? The theological education that you are offering actually has no practical application to Nigeria or China or Korea or Indonesia. So you have to offer something that is practical to them. So if you're going to do ministry in sub-Saharan Africa, are they learning about ancestor veneration and what a Christian response to ancestor veneration might be, or a Christian response to Muslim-Christian relations, or gender relations, or polygamy, or poverty? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. All kinds of subjects that are not included in Western theological education. So if you want your schools to be more global, it's not just who's showing up in the classroom. Your curriculum needs to be global, and that has to include women. So let's not make the same mistake where we make things global by including all the men voices. Let's just right that wrong from the beginning and include both men and women in who you are reading and engaging with.
Oh, that's really helpful. So what we've done is we've taken a look at the past. We've spoken about the current present reality of women in global church. I'd like to look forward a little bit. What role do you envision women playing in the shaping of world Christianity into the next decade? How can the broader Christian community support and facilitate this vision in light of Christ's teachings on unity and service?
So I think the grassroots level will continue to be the women's domain in a lot of ways. Women are still, right, they're mothers who are passing on the faith to their children, grandmothers passing it on to their grandchildren. That is a really important part of faith transmission. If you want the next generation, it's mothers and grandmothers. I would imagine a huge proportion of people listening to this right now got the faith first from a mother or a grandmother. So from that grassroots family level perspective, women are completely central to the story. Now, the other piece of it is we do see women's leadership in churches and organizations. It's still a very, very small portion of leadership of these churches. Will that increase going forward? I think it will, actually. And we're seeing some evidence that there are more churches that are allowing female pastors. Every year, there's another large network that is shifting their opinion on what women can and cannot do in churches. So I do think moving forward, we are going to see more women in leadership positions. And one thing that I'll be watching very closely is how does having women leaders change or influence the culture of a community? Women have very different kinds of leadership styles than men do, and there's been great research on this in Christian settings. So I'm very curious to see those organizational studies that come out to see having women leaders in your church gives you XYZ ABC benefits. I think those studies are starting to come out now, and that's something I'll be looking forward to in the future.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. We've really been zoning in on the topic of women and global Christianity, but that's not the only thing that you focus in on. You do look at global trends, and I'd be amiss if I don't ask you a question on that before we close off the interview. And so looking forward, what emerging trends or potential shifts in world Christianity are you most excited about or concerned about? And how should young Christian leaders be preparing for these changes?
The shift of Christianity to the global south is continuing. So we anticipate by the year 2050, which really is right around the corner, that 77% of all Christians will live in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. 77% of all Christians are going to be global south. That is a huge proportion. Now, one concern I have is all of these global tensions that we have between global north and global south. So we have these dynamics where most of the Christians are in the global south, but most of the Christian wealth is in the global north. Most of the Christians are in the south, but a lot of the missionary sending is still from the north. A lot of the so on and so forth. The Christians are in the south. The Institutes of Theological Education are in the north. So we have these tensions that we have to work out as a global Christian family. And that is not easy. And we do see global denominations splitting all the time over these issues, over human sexuality, over women, over all kinds of things. I would love to see more unity and diversity, more big tent thinking, where we're all united by faith in Jesus Christ and self-identification as Christian and the desire to see this moving forward despite theological differences. I would love to see more relationship first and ideology second. I think that would be really healthy for a lot of local and global communities. Unfortunately, I don't see a ton of evidence in that direction as of yet. Global Christianity is pretty fragmented, unfortunately, on a whole host of issues. But I'm hoping that we can have more global exchanges so we can better understand each other, overcome ideological differences, and really join together in the sake of mission.
Yeah, I mean, I so resonate with what you're saying. I think the need for us as believers is to first and foremost find our identity in Christ, in the family of God. And that needs to be first and foremost. And then it's through that we can easily step out of our national cliques and our international denominations and all these things that divide us. First and foremost, identity needs to come from Christ. And I think it's out of that space that we can step into a more meaningful relationship and dialogue as a global church. Yeah, so Dr. Zula, this has been so helpful and insightful. As people are listening, perhaps they're interested in connecting with you or finding out more about your research. You mentioned a couple of resources and books that you've written and been a part of. Where can people find you online and find out more about the work that you're doing?
So I have my website, ginazurlo.com, but also the website of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, which is globalchristianity.org. And you can find all kinds of resources there.
Wonderful. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes for our listeners. Any closing thoughts before we close off the interview that you would like to leave with our listeners?
I think just one final closing thought is just to reiterate to listen to women. Everyone should walk away from this interview encouraged to listen to women in your life.
Well, I know that I would not be the person I am today if I did not listen to the women in my life. And so I'm taking that challenge, not just from a personal relational point of view, but I'm going to begin to apply that to my church and to my community and even into the ministries that I'm involved in. So Dr. Zola, thank you so much for that final word. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all that you're doing for global Christianity. And yeah, hopefully we'll have you again on the podcast.
Sounds good. Thank you.